Well, good evening, fellow fugitives of the city. Bring it up there, please. Well, for the benefit of those of you who are outside of our listening area, I'm going to warn you, tonight is drug night. It's been drug night on the station all day. And by the way, that brings up some interesting thoughts that I've had from time to time. And one of them is that this is probably the talkingest generation in the history of man. In other words, what is this? It just clips onto my nose, Jimmy. It's all right. It's not real. No, I take it off when George comes around. Don't offend him. However, the point that I'm making here is that since this is drug night, I would like to know, just offhand, I'm just curious, how many hours of talk about drugs has been logged in the United States in the past 10 years? I mean, it would be astronomical. Talk has never solved any problem, I'm afraid, even though we tend to believe today that talk does not only solve the problem, but it substitutes for almost anything else. In fact, I think that talk today has risen to such a fantastic proportions that the old biblical legend of the Tower of Babel is literally coming true. Now, I don't know whether you know much about the Bible, and I'm not biblically oriented myself, but the Tower of Babel has curious relevancy in this day, where millions of voices are rising and nobody's listening, but everybody's talking. There's a steady uproar of a cacophony of tongues discussing practically every conceivable problem, and incidentally inventing quite a few problems, because ultimately, the longer you talk about things, the more you will find to complain about. And so I'm just curious how much of the problems of our time comes from and it's not communicating. Remember this, I'm not against communicating because I don't think talking has much to do with communication today. Talk is an act that is performed almost like a football game. It's a profession today. There are professional panelists. There are professional appearers on talk shows. You go across the dial and you'll hear the same guys blabbing away constantly on various talk shows about any conceivable problem. Writers are professional, and I'm talking about a certain type of problem-oriented writer. These are professional blabbers, and it goes on and on and on. And I don't want to be accused of being anti-intellectual, because generally that's what is often said if you're against, say, an endless stream of drug books, or an endless stream of books about sex, an endless stream of books about the city blight and one thing and another. That I am afraid today, and I really seriously believe this. I haven't talked. I don't recall ever talking much about this on the show, but I'm really seriously concerned today with what I consider one of the major problems of our time, and it's not only in America. That is the substitution of symbolic. I suppose you can use the word hieroglyphics. The substitution of symbolic noises or marks for positive action in one way or another. In other words, one of the problems with much of American politics today is that a politician will give a speech about something, everyone will applaud it, but they never really think in terms of the speech actually being implemented into action. And so everybody's for, let's say, doing away with segregation. And then the day that it happens, everybody starts yelling. No, I was trying to say segregation salvation. No, this is no Freudian slips. I'm sorry, Jerry. I'm sorry. If you that's what you're thinking, I'm just simply saying that everybody claims he's for a thing, but when it actually begins to happen, then there's a lot of uproar. We see it today in the current administration, for example, where the administration has come out year after year for economy in government. Well, everybody agrees that this is probably a good thing, but the minute that it's implemented 500 senators rise as a single man, and that their particular little thing is going to be knocked out, their little pork barrel thing home. You know, they're going to do away with the bridge that goes over the Whispering Canyon of West Virginia. So then they start yelling. In other words, a speech is considered an act in itself today, and it better stop right there. So I'm just wondering whether or not this endless talk about drugs has any value at all, except to be ultimately boring. Because it is a problem that we all know about by now. After all, I think in the initial stage of discussion, it's good to talk about things. But today, in 1973, it would be almost impossible to find a human being in America who has not clocked personally at least 25 hours of listening to people talk about drugs, whether it's on the David Susskind show, whether it's on... Yeah, and, well, ultimately, you can't blame the man for saying it goes in one ear and out the other, because this is what's happening with the talkers, too. It goes in one mouth and out the other. It's just endless cacophony of talk. So some people are listeners, others are talkers. But damn few are doers. And this is where we ultimately get into the problem, when you substitute a symbolic action for a real action. Now, symbolism in this whole problem-solving world has become a very big business, too, I might add. So the button industry a few years ago was a tremendous industry, because the button is a symbol. Now, that doesn't mean the symbol has any basis in reality. So some of the most hateful people I knew wore buttons that said love on them, or had pictures of doves. So whether or not the symbol has much to do with the way the person is beyond discussion. So tonight is drug night here. Now, there's nothing I can say about drugs that will add to the general knowledge of drugs. In fact, the few people who really do know about drugs are generally ignored in the talk about drugs. Now, what is the average panel? You've probably heard a dozen of them on this radio station today. What is the average panel? What does it consist of? Well, they generally get a priest. What the hell he knows about drugs is beyond me, but they get one. He may work in the slums, and he claims he knows about drugs. Well, then they'll get a policeman, some police executive, who knows really about the problem, but what he knows about drugs per se is minimal, because most MDs don't know much about drugs. You aware of that? That some of my very good friends are highly qualified physicians, and their knowledge of drugs is not much more than yours, really, in many cases, because the problem of drugs is now the problem of a specialist. It is. Just as many doctors really will frankly tell you they don't know much about neurosurgery. Why not? Well, they're a pediatrician. It's a specialized world. And so the average panel today will consist of a vociferous doctor. It'll consist of... what his specialty is usually of no consideration. He may be a specialist in dermatology, but he's got ideas on drugs, so here he is. You see the priest. He's on the panel. You've seen that. Then there's always an ex-junkie. He appears. That's like asking an alcoholic, what the effect of alcohol is on the bloodstream. He doesn't know. He just takes the stuff, But he's there, too. And so ultimately we get all these voices going, and most of them are not informed. And the real people who should know something about drugs are rarely contacted. For example, I have an acquaintance who is a leading pharmacologist whose entire career for something like 30 years has been based on investigating the effect of barbiturates, or if you prefer barbiturates, it's often pronounced that way. But his field is the effect of barbiturates on human tissue and on the human bloodstream. Do you know that he has never been asked to appear on a television or a radio show? Not once. And he sits in front of his TV set roaring sometimes with laughter at some of the stuff that's said by ex-junkies, by the Peter Fonda type, and so on up and down the line. He just and he spent for 30 years, he's been a leading expert in the field. Now, so I guess what we really are doing these days, we're not really talking about drugs. We're producing shows, which is a very different thing. Just like in the sense, did you ever see West Side Story? Well, did West Side Story tell you much about poverty? Did it deal with the problem of juvenile gangs? No, it was a show. And so in the middle of the thing, a guy jumps up on the fire escape and sings, Maria, Maria, Maria. Well, he reminds me of the average speech maker on the average David Susskind deep discussion about any given subject. So I think if this doesn't seem to you to be relevant to the world of drugs, I think it's very relevant. And that the talk, the constant hoopla of talk that goes on, has become kind of funny. And you know, this is not new. That the talk about drugs has gone back many, many centuries. It's not a new problem, no way. Although to most people, I suspect, drugs seem to be a new problem. Generally speaking, drugs are new as you might say, as a national preoccupation to the Western world. That the drug problem, if you want to designate it that, the drug psychosis, if you want to designate it as that, the drug escape, if you look at it that way, the drug salvation, if you refer to it as that, they're called all these different things by many different people, has been a very common and persistent problem in other countries for a long time, in fact, centuries. In fact, a few years ago, I had an interesting thing happen to me one night down at this is WOR, New York. A few years ago, I had an interesting thing happen to me. An engineer from northern China who is a friend of mine and who came to America just after World War II. And he had been in China for a few years after the communist takeover there, when the communism took over China. And we're making no political remark here, but he was there at the time, and he was sent to a far northern part of China to do a job with another engineer. He was just out of university at the time, and he was sent up there, and he was astounded when he got up there to find that something that he had had heard for all his life was actually happening. He saw a whole line, a tremendous line of coolies. Now, this is a story I'm not inventing. I'm just telling a story that he told me. And he is a well-known Chinese and well-respected, in fact, a world-respected engineer, and has been used on many United Nations jobs throughout the world, engineering jobs. And he said that he remembers going to this camp where he was to do this job on a far remote outpost in northern China. And he sees this long line of coolies. Now, he said in that time there was very little mechanical help available in China, and the coolie was like a beast of burden, literally. They were used the same way that horses were used, the same way that donkeys are used, and so forth. And he sees this long line of coolies carrying gigantic loads of sand. They were making a dam, actually, and they needed it in the concrete. And they were carrying this great big load on their back. And he said it was a weird sight. These guys were moving in a long line, and they would stop and rest occasionally. They would stop the whole line. They'd never say anything. And these guys were all, according to him, he says they were all working for just one thing, and that was opium. That's what they worked for, and they were given their supply of it every day. And he says they just labored as animals for month after month, year after year, until ultimately they dropped. Now, he said he made a